Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to meet you here today to talk about a subject that is so dear to us, at the new Acropolis School of Philosophy, Fernando Pessoa. It is truly a wonderful opportunity to speak about him. Not only because of his poetry, his poems are marvelous, but also as a professor of philosophy, which is the perspective we will be exploring. We will balance a bit between the poetic aspect, the biographical aspect, the posture that lies behind it, the values, and the worldview that underpin this enigma that was Fernando Pessoa. It is interesting to observe that, when we delve a little deeper into the subject, we realize how much he, in fact, I couldn't say whether he was more of a philosopher or more of a poet. He was a bit of both, and he was great at it. So, it is very difficult for someone, even if they do not have a great appreciation for poetry, not to know Fernando Pessoa and not to be amazed by the true magic he weaves with words. Today, we will explore this topic a little. I know that many people are already familiar with his story. There must be admirers of his work here. His story is not uncommon, it is very well known. But there are some things, some details, and then I will bring to you what interests me most, which is Fernando Pessoa as he saw himself and his philosophical stances. What was behind it all? What was behind the scenes that allowed him to reach such elevated levels of beautifully expressing philosophical truths? When we observe poetic language and how it clothes knowledge in beauty, it gives that knowledge a certain timelessness. It is one thing to describe a fact, it is another to express it wrapped in beauty. By doing so, you grant it a kind of immortality. So, poetry is a wonderful way to draw out knowledge from its temporal context and project it upward, projecting it towards something timeless. And truly, Fernando Pessoa, when he sets out to do this, demonstrates an extraordinary ability. It is no coincidence that, in one of the passages from his diaries, which are very revealing, he says that he had already read so much that now he knew the grammar of poetry. He knew which elements he needed to work with. He no longer felt the need to read so much anymore. According to him, he even preferred to open the book of nature, the book of life, rather than a book where people were using techniques that, in general, he himself used better. With one exception whom he deeply respected throughout his life, William Shakespeare, whom he considered to be enlightened. With other authors, there came a certain point when he grew weary and set them aside. There comes a time when he says, "Well, I hardly read anymore, because there just isn't much that is new. I am tired of people who are merely intelligent." In other words, those who are not profound, who do not go much further. They are only intelligent, only clever. So, it is interesting for us to realize that he truly managed to accomplish things that are prodigious. Today, this is unanimous. In general, critics regard Fernando Pessoa not only as a great figure in Portuguese literature, in the Portuguese language that he so deeply loved, but also as a giant of world literature. He, who once said that it was time for a new Luís de Camões, without realizing that perhaps he himself was that very figure. The one who would elevate the Portuguese language to such a level of greatness that world literature would be compelled to bow before it. Fernando Pessoa is a treasure of world literature. Well, I found something interesting and I brought it here for you. Let's say a caricature made out of letters by a Brazilian cartoonist named Byron Portes from Belém do Pará. He creates works inspired by Fernando Pessoa's initials. He shakes his face. I found it quite fascinating. So, let us begin by briefly discussing some passages that are simply unavoidable. Let us talk a little about his biography, just to recap, because I know everyone already knows a bit, considering what we have already learned. Fernando Pessoa's life is as ordinary as his literature is extraordinary. There is a kind of proportionality to it. That is intriguing. There was a literary critic, whose name escapes me, who actually spoke about this. His life is absolutely ordinary. What is anything but ordinary is his body of work. So, his life is simple. It is interesting for us to know about it, because nowadays there is always a certain mistake people make, a kind of determinism, trying to deduce his inspiration from the life he led. Which, to me, makes no sense at all. Living as Pessoa did, in whatever way he lived, he would have been who he was. I do not believe that one can deduce his tendency toward isolation, toward metaphysic, from his life experiences. I believe he is who he is, and he would have been so regardless. In any case, let us get to know a bit of his biography. Look, how charming. So, I will not go into too much detail. You can go through the entire text. We know that he lost his father at the age of 5, and his mother remarried. When he was 7 years old, she married by proxy a military officer who was the Portuguese consul in South Africa. And at 7, his mother then goes with him to live in South Africa, where he stays for almost 10 years, a little over 9 years. He learns to read and write in South Africa, so he becomes literate in English. He almost leaves for England to study at Oxford and never returns, thankfully for the Portuguese language. For some reason which is still somewhat debated, he does not go and instead returns to Portugal and begins to write in Portuguese. It is interesting because everyone knows it is a very famous passage where he says, "The poet is a pretender." Do you remember? Fernando Pessoa is a tremendous pretender, and it seems that this trait appeared very early, since he was 7 years old. Because it's curious how he seems. This, according to his own aunt, who says, look, his mother did not intend to take him. This is well known. A second marriage, starting life over, she did not intend to take the son from her first marriage. She planned to leave him with his aunts, and he writes a little poem for his mother. It seems that this little poem, at just 7 years old, we will see it in a moment, convinced his mother to take him to South Africa. This, according to his aunt. I don't know if this story is real or not, but we will see that he has this curiosity, which he himself mentions in his diary. He says, sometimes I take on a literary style, writing to myself. Look, this diary, look at what I wrote up above. Isn't this spontaneous? I am encouraging myself in my own diary. And he almost conducts an experiment with various personalities. He says, when I was a child, I was already inventing heteronyms. And that's true, isn't it? Here, it talks a bit about this Chevalier de Pas, a heteronym he created in his childhood. And he says that from a young age, he created countless heteronyms and carried out psychological experiments by placing himself in different positions. Deep down, throughout his life, Fernando Pessoa always felt a certain envy of a being who was capable of fully embracing his own positions, who knew who they were and presented themselves to the world in that way. He did not have that. Within him existed a universe of different things. So he did not take a fixed stance. His positions were very changeable. Thus, through his heteronym, each of them is ideologically very well defined. They assume their own positions. In fact, we can describe them very clearly. He defined them very clearly. He himself, however, is not so clearly defined. So, from childhood, he began conducting psychological experiments. We will see here some important facts. He became a translator of commercial texts in adulthood, thanks to the English he learned as a child. Thus, he lived a very modest life, occasionally working in commercial offices, translating texts into Portuguese. Amidst all this, a rather significant event occurs. A very mysterious gentleman asks him to translate into Portuguese none other than The Voice of the Silence by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. This will become a very important event in his life. But let us proceed calmly, taking one thing at a time. Here we will see the publication of his book Mensagem in 1934, which was the only book in Portuguese that he saw published during his lifetime. Apart from that, he had a few books of poetry in English. He wrote frequently in English. He passed away at the age of 47. Still quite young, but according to what we see in the few photos that remain, he appeared rather aged. He suffered from psychological turmoil throughout his life, which wore him down prematurely. At a certain point, Fernando Pessoa himself even considered admitting himself to a psychiatric clinic. He reached such a level of psychological disturbance that he could no longer bear himself. He wrote this explicitly in his diaries, which are fascinating documents to examine. I cannot stand myself anymore. There is a hurricane of things inside me, and I cannot find myself among them. So, he lived a very troubled life, psychologically speaking, with very high points, very low points, and a violent oscillation between them. Family album. I thought you would enjoy these images. Images of all kinds. Here, for example, is the poem I mentioned to you. Look how interesting. Described as a child. He already had a character trait that he would develop greatly as he reached adulthood. Very patriotic. He loved Portugal. He loved the Portuguese language. He was always like that. So he wrote this poem, something that revealed itself in his character. He wrote this poem for his mother. To my dear mother. O lands of Portugal, O lands where I was born, as much as I love them, I love. I still love you even more. In other words, as much as I love Portugal, I love you even more. What is he trying to say? I love Portugal, but if you leave, take me with you. In a certain way, that's what he means. I love Portugal very much, but I love you even more. In other words, if you leave, take me with you. He said that, well, we will never truly know how much of this is real. It may have been more of an emotional appeal than manipulation to keep his mother from leaving, and it worked. He goes, and his mother has several children. With her second husband, she ends up having 5 children. And he apparently lives without major issues within the family with his adoptive father. In fact, when they return to Portugal, he goes back to living with him. There are no reports of significant conflicts between him and his stepfather. And so, I brought you a collection of family photos, including the voice of a relative who had psychiatric problems. These issues were already present in the family. In his life, he saw others like him, such as some aunts. He was always in contact with this relative and had severe psychiatric issues. His mother, when he was very little, his mother, his stepfather, and him with his siblings in Dupont on the house's balcony. You may proceed. There are no known photos, at least I have not found any, of his biological father, who passed away when he was still very young. This is the house in Dupont. You can see that he leads a life of considerable means. His father has substantial resources, and his stepfather is also well off. He attends good schools and enjoys a high standard of living, at least while he is living with his family. Let's move on. Well, this is interesting. We will see at the end that there is a huge trunk in which Fernando Pessoa left a vast collection, thousands of pages, many of which have not yet been published to this day. There are still notes by Fernando Pessoa that remain unpublished to this day. Diaries, letters to many people, letters to himself, reflections, drafts of poems, truly in the order of thousands. And this was discovered not many years ago, just a little over a decade. It is like a code of honor that he wrote for himself. He, with his particular inclination, was 17 years old when he wrote this. He supposedly writes to a somewhat diabolical character, whom he calls Satan. He writes this code as a proposition for what he would do throughout his life. He always had an interest in esotericism. We will see that he oscillates between various tendencies until he chooses a path and delves deeper into it. Logically, at this point, we would have to go into. There is an entire story to explain to you what he meant by Satan, and not the Christian devil as we know it. In fact, he often questioned these concepts deeply. Well, then, the code of conduct he writes is for himself, at 17 years of age. Never abandon or withdraw from the purpose of doing good for humanity. Never write sensual or other types of things that could cause harm or offense to those who read them. Never forget, when criticizing religion in the name of truth, that religion is only replaced with great difficulty, and that poor human beings weep in darkness. For never forget the sufferings and illnesses of humanity. So this is interesting, because this proposal, this code of honor that he writes for himself at 17 years old, it is something he upholds very well as an autonomous individual, that is, as Fernando Pessoa himself. As a heteronym, he does not. Sometimes, as a heteronym, especially as Alberto Cairo.
Sometimes he goes against this code.
But he gives himself this poetic license to, by using alternative personalities, adopt other behaviors that do not follow his own codes. And it is interesting that we could give an entire lecture just about this, showing you that sometimes, when you look at his writings as himself, that is, as Fernando Pessoa, and when he writes as other characters, there are ideological contradictions. These are ways of thinking that cannot fit within a single book or a single person. There are contradictions. In other words, in a certain way, he expresses all these doubts, all these restlessness, all these insecurities, which is one of the things that Fernando Pessoa clearly and repeatedly mentions in his diary. I even brought you an excerpt from this diary. It shows how much he lacked the willpower necessary to impose his ideas upon the world. And because he lacked this determination, this will, the flow would reverse. And, many times, the world would impose ideas upon him. We will see him, throughout his life, sometimes developing along paths with which, later on, he no longer agrees. Or even with things that, at that very moment, he does not fully agree with. If you observe his three main heteronyms, Álvaro de Campos, Alberto Cairo, and Ricardo Reis, each of them embodies a stance that, at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, was in vogue. There was the trend of absolute skepticism that denies all metaphysics, represented by Alberto Cairo. There was also the trend of a mentality focused on novelty, protest, the pursuit of the new, and the rejection of everything old, embodied by Álvaro de Campos. And then there is the trend of conservatism, the one who radically rejects everything new, represented by Ricardo Reis. So, he projects all these needs for public acceptance. All possible personalities are expressed through heteronyms. And these heteronyms are, as I have already mentioned, sometimes contradictory with each other and even with himself. It is quite curious, he claims to be a disciple of one of his own heteronyms, Alberto Cairo. But Alberto Cairo has nothing to do with metaphysics. And Fernando Pessoa has moments of truly impressive metaphysics. Some of the most beautiful I have ever seen in my life, in terms of poetic form. So, we notice these contradictions, and sometimes many of his heteronyms do not respect this code of honor. He does, under his own name, Fernando Pessoa, yes. But sometimes he gets lost and no longer really knows who Fernando Pessoa is. Amidst all of this, these were his moments of greatest crisis. Well, and here I am sharing this with you just as a point of curiosity. When he begins to write, he starts writing in English. So, these three books, in addition to Mensagem, are the three books I mentioned, which are published in Life. 3 small books of poems in English, and Mensagem, which was written in Portuguese because of a contest that was held in Portugal by the Estado Novo of that time, the military state, which proposed a tribute to the country, but in reality, what they wanted was praise for the political regime of the era. And that he does not do. He creates a very poetic, highly idealized, and elevated vision of Portugal, but there is no reference to the government. And because of that, he does not win. He comes in second place, not first. You know that he refused to accept the prize. Proud as he was, he said he was not a man for second place. And when we will see Mensagem, you will see that, indeed, Mensagem is not a book for second place. So, it is the only book he saw published during his lifetime. But let's move on. Here, still during his time in Durban, when he was a brilliant young boy, he says he was always the top student. He participated in this competition, wrote the essay in English, and among more than 800 candidates, he took first place. First place in the Queen Victoria competition with his essay in English. This was a source of pride for his school, after all. And later, when he was preparing to apply for a scholarship at the University of Oxford, he also took first place, because he achieved the highest score. Now, there was an interesting detail. This competition required that, in the last 4 years, he had lived in the province of Natal, that is, in South Africa. And he had spent almost a year away, at his relative's house in Portugal. And he lost that Oxford scholarship because of this. I say thanks to that, because it turned out to be a blessing for us. If Fernando Pessoa had gone to Oxford, we would have lost him. Perhaps he would never have returned. Who knows what might have happened? He probably would have become a great English poet. And he had that opportunity in his hands, but he lost it. So he returned to Portugal, and considering what happened to him there, who knows if he would have stayed in Oxford? Because when Fernando Pessoa returns to Lisbon, one of the first things he does is enroll in the Faculty of Letters at the University of Lisbon. He can't even last a year there. I think there was nothing left for him to learn there. Would he have been able to endure Oxford? Perhaps not either. I truly believe there was nothing for him to learn there. In less than a year, he leaves the university. He begins to live in modest accommodations. It's interesting, in one of the passages from his diary, he tries to calculate how many dollars he would need to survive, because did the minimum and spent the time writing. So he worked in 2 offices, mostly doing translation, especially of commercial texts. He would usually go to these offices twice a week. In other words, he earned just the minimum amount of money he needed to survive. For him, surviving meant paying rent for a very modest place. And almost every night, he would go to a cafe called a Brasileira, where it is said that he would drink rather significant amounts of wine, beer, and even cachaca. The cachaca he liked most was called Água Imperial. So, he basically calculated what he needed for that, and he worked just enough to cover those needs. The rest of his time was devoted to writing. Writing for newspapers and magazines. Gradually, he began to carve out a space for himself in the publishing world. He also started to get involved with young writers and poets of the time, such as Mario de Sá Carneiro, for example, and Almada Negreiros. And it was through the influence of this group that he began to shape what is considered the beginning of modernism in Portuguese poetry. And he would become a powerful influence through the magazine Orfeu, which he launched together with these writers. Here, we see the first magazine he began to publish, which was Água, and it still had a rather conservative character. You will notice that, in truth, Fernando Pessoa always had his own style, always had his own way of writing, and he did not, at least not at that time, have such a strong ideological involvement with the ideals of modernism. He truly enters the realm of science, greatly influenced by his friends, especially Mario de Sá Carneiro. So much so that he writes for this magazine, which at first had a moderately conservative character. But then he is invited by his friends, with whom he gathered every night, and it's interesting, because it really was every night. This is recorded in his diary. He would clock in at this bar every night. First, it was a Brasileira, and later another bar that eventually replaced it. Curiously, both of them still exist to this day. There is even a statue of Fernando Pessoa there. He would frequent these bars every night to discuss literature and exchange ideas. And there came a certain point when he began to mention in his diary, and also in letters to various correspondents, that he felt alone in these places. He would listen to people, but it seemed that what they said was always the same, and he preferred to converse with his heteronyms, which understood him. People simply couldn't understand him. People were sometimes interesting, from the perspective of being intellectuals and knowing many things, but when he tried to elevate the conversation, they couldn't keep up. So, he felt somewhat lonely within that group. And he started to distance himself. With the exception of Mario de Sá Carneiro, who would remain his friend until death. Mario de Sá Carneiro committed suicide in Paris in 1916 or 1917, and was his friend until the end. But gradually, he kept withdrawing. So, as I was telling you, the magazine, especially the magazine Orfeu, which circulated for a very short time, mainly due to a lack of financial resources, did not last, but it had a tremendous impact on the public because it introduced the entire ideology of modernism. There comes a certain point when Fernando Pessoa, according to confessions he shares with these same friends, begins to feel that any ideology, any brand, does not really fit him. He has his own style, his own way. Sometimes he uses a more classical form, sometimes he enjoys writing a sonnet, and at other times he writes in a completely free manner. In other words, it is as if his school is himself. So, he does not confine himself to any one thing for very long, although he is indeed considered one of those who most brilliantly opened up the modernist movement in Portugal. Thus, we will see some of the magazines he was involved with throughout his life, first Aguia, then Orpheus, which lasted for a very short time, and finally, Athena. Athena is also another magazine that he launched together with his circle of friends. And then he begins to isolate himself. As I mentioned to you, Mario de Sacairo died in 1917. And the following year, Santa Rita Pintor would pass away, a Portuguese writer who also launched this magazine together with him. However, it is a magazine that has a small print run and a short lifespan, but it truly made a significant impact. And it began to generate an entire trend within Portuguese literature, which was already being spread in other European countries. And it enters Portugal through this, let's say, basically through this publication. You may proceed. Well, here I will have to do something with you that I don't particularly enjoy, but it is a necessity. In public speaking, we usually do not recommend putting this much text on a PowerPoint slide. So, I ask for poetic license from the art of oratory, but in truth, it is impossible to speak about Fernando Pessoa without speaking through his own words, which is the most faithful way to do so. So I selected some excerpts. Everything that will be read, whenever you see these slides filled with text, those are his own writings. So, in this sense, we ask for a bit of leeway from the art of oratory and will work with these texts, which is very important. We are now moving away from the biographical perspective and entering a philosophical aspect, which is to imagine who Fernando Pessoa truly is. Who is behind this mosaic? A solitary man, but at the same time, someone who occasionally complains about loneliness and misses his family. When the family returns to Lisbon, he goes back to living with them. At the same time, he feels the need to isolate himself. A man who longs for spirituality, but suddenly believes in nothing, denying everything he once believed in from one moment to the next. A man who oscillates between various worlds. But what we notice is that there are certain things that are not present in any of his heteronyms. They exist only within himself. Mysticism, for example, this aspect of love for the occult, love or mystery. An aspect that is not religious, he considers himself a neo-pagan, but it is a vision of God that does not fit into any religion. None at all, and it is a search. But at the same time that he seeks, when he finds something, he retreats. He is afraid to commit. So, he keeps oscillating between various poles and suffers greatly because of it. We will see Fernando Pessoa by himself. This facet of esotericism, you can see that these are drawings made by himself. He always had a deep interest in horoscopes, and he himself. He draws and creates his own chart, his own astrological map. He studies alchemy extensively and delves deeply into various traditions, all on his own. So, this text is from a letter he wrote to a friend named Adolfo Casas Montero on January 13, 1935. It has this level of precision because it is well documented. So, in response to a question that Adolfo asked him, he replies in the following way. I still need to answer your question regarding occultism. You ask me if I believe in occultism. Asked in this way, the question is not very clear. However, I understand your intention, and I will answer it. I believe in the existence of worlds superior to our own, and in the inhabitants of those worlds, as well as in experiences of various degrees of spirituality, becoming more and more subtle until reaching a supreme being who presumably created this world. It may be that there are other equally supreme beings who have created other universes, and that these universes coexist with ours, whether interpenetrating or not. This is interesting because when he is Fernando Pessoa, when he is truly himself, he reaches, at certain moments, metaphysical levels that are truly impressive. There is a passage from a poem that belongs to Mensagem, which is Ulysses, where he offers a definition of myth. And look, well, he works with philosophy, and he works with it deeply. The definition of myth that he gives, poetically, in just 2 or 3 lines, surpasses many treatises on the subject. He is capable of an impressive metaphysics, and this is part of his very nature. But it seems that Fernando Pessoa plays a bit like Penelope, that Penelope from mythology, who weaves her tapestry during the day and unravels it at night. It seems that when he begins to rise too high, he himself becomes afraid and retreats. Then you notice that he starts to extrapolate, to overflow, as if it were a safety anchor. This happens through various heteronyms that mock that very metaphysical stance he holds. So, for example, Alberto Cairo denies any kind of metaphysics. It is as if, at a certain moment, Fernando Pessoa could see God with clarity, truly see the myth, reaching a rare level of metaphysical perception. And suddenly, he denies any metaphysics. And he does this as a kind of anchor, as a way, it seems, to avoid rising too high. Of course, we will talk a bit about this. In fact, it is natural that in human life we must adapt to different circumstances. But adapting does not mean adulterating your essence, your fundamental principles. There is an axis around which human consciousness expands. Fernando Pessoa did not have just one axis, he had several. This is the kind of thing that, logically, tends to generate a very significant psychological imbalance. He himself says, I suffer from some kind of hysteria, neurasthenia, whatever it may be, because it is terrible how one oscillates in the face of such contradictory things. So, let's take a look at some of what he believed about esotericism. Continuing, you may proceed. This is quite interesting. It is a letter from him to Mario de Sacairo. Mario de Sacairo seems to be startled by this, because he abruptly changes his position. He hovered around this love for the occult, for its mystery, and was very interested in alchemy. But one fine day, as I mentioned to you, someone introduced him to a book and asked him to translate it. The Voice of the Silence, which had been written with great difficulty in English by Helena Blavatsky. And it is requested, and he does this translation. You know that not only this book, but a series of other theosophical books are translated into Portuguese by Fernando Pessoa. Here, I have even included for you the cover of an edition of The Voice of the Silence, with his translation. So, imagine what kind of impact this must have had, because Theosophy organized all of his ideas and created such a structured system where everything he thought made sense, that at the same time, he was dazzled. And, at the same time, he was also frightened. And so, this letter of his to Mario de Sacairo, the first part of the intellectual crisis. Now you know what it is. The one that has appeared now. It stems from the circumstance of my having come into contact with theosophical doctrines. The way I came to know them was utterly ordinary. I had to translate theosophical books. It shook me to a degree that, today, I would consider impossible, especially when it comes to any religious system. The extremely broad character of this religion philosophy, the notion of strength, of mastery, of a superior and extra-human knowledge that are distilled from theosophical works, disturbed me deeply. The possibility that there, in theosophy, lies the real truth stands before me. Theosophy frightens me with its mystery. It is the horror and the allure of the abyss realized in the realm beyond the soul. It is my own metaphysical dread, my dear friend. And it is interesting, this impact that theosophy provokes in him and the interest it awakens, and the study he begins to undertake, because he reads at a dizzying speed and takes notes, and, at a certain point, he abruptly pulls back. In one of his notes, in a letter he writes to one of his correspondents, he explains why he abruptly pulls back, which is quite curious. At that time, life was no longer anything particularly new. Helena Blavatsky had died in 1891, and here we are already around the years 1915, 1917. Helena Blavatsky had, during her lifetime, been accused of charlatanism and a number of other things. There had been a highly manipulated case against her, brought by a society dedicated to specific research. Psychical research, which had declared that she was a charlatan. In short, there was an entire campaign, as there often is in such cases involving bold thinkers like her, a campaign of defamation that did not die with her, but continued throughout the 20th century. It is interesting that Fernando Pessoa, after reading books such as The Voice of the Silence, was more inclined to believe in the defamations than in what he himself had read. Read. But there was an element here that we will see very clearly revealed in his own diaries. A fear of confronting public opinion so forcefully. A need for acceptance. A fear of, suddenly, adopting positions that might be considered scandalous. A fear of taking stances that could, in some way, compromise him. The fact is that he becomes intimidated. The reputation that the Theosophical Society had at that time, especially Helena Blavatsky, was very heavy. It demanded a courage that he himself reveals in his diaries from that period. So he retreats, he distances himself from theosophy, he does not have the courage to take this involvement much further. It is very interesting that we will see this constantly happen in history. Some time ago, I gave a lecture, which I hope I might have the opportunity to present again here at Cultura, about the songs of Cecília Meirelles, which are marvelous in terms of the Portuguese language, and as a Brazilian writer, they are among the most beautiful and metaphysical works we have in poetry. And these songs by Cecília Meirelles, she did not have the courage to publish them during her lifetime, nor even the courage to show them to anyone. They were discovered, hidden among her personal writings, after she passed away. If we observe what she wrote, what was published and awarded, you can sense the fear. And there was a very real possibility of being identified with a line of thought that was not in fashion, that did not bring fame or results at that time. So, even Fernando Pessoa himself acknowledges a certain shyness, a certain fear of taking such positive, strong stances in the face of public opinion. And he retreats. He distances himself from theosophy. In other words, all that drive, all that initial impact, he does not sustain for very long. When he came into contact with what it truly meant to be a theosophist at that time, he was not willing to pay the price and turn back. And he began to get involved with things that were, let's say, more superficial, easier, such as, for example, an English magician, Aleister Crowley. He was an astrologer who practiced a kind of circus-like magic, we will see, very superficial. He starts to get involved with things that are a bit more sensational and superficial. He doesn't go very deep. This part is very beautiful and, in particular, it interests us. We are philosophers from a school that works with philosophy, culture, and volunteering. In other words, idealism is fundamental for us. And we notice how strong it is, not only here in this text, but in various passages of his own poems, the need for a commitment to humanity. A need to go beyond, a need for a positive commitment to humanity. And how, in truth, he became somewhat inhibited in relation to this. He says, I plan to fly, but in reality, my selfishness clips my wings. And that is exactly what happens. In a certain way, he has an insecurity, even a psychological one, a psychological instability that clips his wings and does not allow him to commit himself so strongly. Not in the way he imagined, which was his idealism, his commitment to humanity. This passage is truly beautiful. Forgive the length, but I couldn't cut anything from it. I found it very beautiful. It is a letter from him. It is a correspondent, which is also an interesting detail. Remember, the poet is a pretender. Fernando Pessoa has a characteristic that is quite intriguing. Depending on whom he is writing to, the text becomes similar to that of his correspondent. And this reveals a certain need for, let's say, acceptancy, a bit of longing for connection. There is a passage, you may remember, or perhaps you've heard, that he had only one girlfriend in his life, and he himself admits that, during the first phase of that relationship, he wanted to observe and feel, psychologically, what it was like to be someone in love. So he began writing extremely passionate notes to the young woman as a kind of psychological experiment. A young woman, a 19-year-old girl, he called her Ophelia. And then, after a while, he begins to feel a sense of guilt because he realizes that she was truly falling in love, so he pulls back. At a certain point, he writes to an aunt, and this aunt. It seems she had some involvement with the Spiritist movement in Portugal, which was just beginning at the time, and he writes to her saying that he had awakened to mediumship, describing mediumistic phenomena. You notice that, From time to time, he blends what he says with the expectations of the listener.
So I don't know who it was. Adolfo Casas Montero, I am not familiar with this individual. But the fact is, every time he writes to this gentleman, he reveals a very idealistic, very mystical, and highly elevated side of himself.
There was something of himself in it, because he wouldn't be able to express it with authenticity. But it's also clear that he didn't reveal this to just anyone. He revealed it only to those who were capable of reinforcing that quality within him. Well, then, we will see this excerpt from that long letter.
Adolfo Casas Montero.
Of those who are close to me, in a literary sense, you know well that, no matter how superior they may be as artists, as souls, no matter how superior they may be as artists. As souls they do not truly count, since none of them possess the awareness, which for me is a daily experience, of the tremendous importance of life, this awareness that makes it impossible for us to create art merely for arts, and without the consciousness of a duty to fulfill toward ourselves and humanity. He speaks of his companions. They are artistically brilliant, but they lack a sense of commitment, a sense of mission.
At a certain point, he says, that bores me terribly.
It seems that the more intellectual they are, the more tedious they become, because they hide behind their intellectuality and lack true depth. So here, he reveals a bit of his own solitude. Thus, my sensitivity grows ever deeper, and my awareness ever greater of the terrible and sacred mission that every person of genius receives from God as their unique gift. All that is mere literary futility, mere art for art's sake, gradually sounds more and more hollow and repugnant to me. Little by little, yet surely, in the divine and intimate fulfillment of an evolution whose ends remain hidden from me, I have been raising my purposes and ambitions ever higher, in accordance with the qualities I have received. To have an impact on humanity, to contribute with all the strength of my effort to civilization, has become the solemn and weighty purpose of my life. No other attitude is possible, in light of one's own sense of duty, for those who look with reverence upon the sorrowful and mysterious spectacle of the world. Now, having seen everything and felt everything, I have the duty to withdraw into my home, into my spirit, and to work as much as I can and in every way I can for the progress of civilization and the broadening of humanity's consciousness. I call insincere those things that are done merely to astonish.
And also, notice this, because it is important, those things that do not contain a fundamental metaphysical idea, that is, through which there does not pass, even if only like a breeze, a sense of the gravity and mystery of life.
Understand that this is prose, poetic in nature. How beautiful it is. That was his intention.
And you can see that there are times when he is absolutely faithful. It is as if it were a different honor code. He is absolutely faithful. There are moments when he truly elevates human consciousness to a level that few have been able to reach.
I am a great admirer of poetry,
and I am reasonably well versed in it.
Few are capable of elevating consciousness to the level that Fernando Pessoa achieves at certain moments. But at other times, he makes great downward inflection points. Not necessarily in terms of quality, from a certain perspective. Technically speaking, they are not bad, because Fernando Pessoa is, technically, perfect most of the time. But ideologically, he is not always faithful to these ideas. He is contradictory. So much so that it truly seems as if he is not just one, but many, and he gets lost in the midst of all this. He himself says, I am dispersion personified. I lose myself in the midst of my own dispersion. You may go on. Well, I have brought 2 poems for you.
I won't spend too much time reciting poems here, because, in fact, at the end, we will have a presentation by some people who recite very well, who have carefully chosen some beautiful poems for you.
But, particularly regarding idealism, to reinforce that point we just discussed earlier, these 2 are very telling. So, I couldn't help but bring them. The first one is from the book Mensagem, The Fifth Empire. Sad is the one who lives at home, content with their own home, without a dream in the lifting of wings, making the embers of the fireplace burn even brighter as they abandon it. Sad is the one who is happy, who lives simply because life endures. Nothing in their soul tells them more than the lesson of the root, to have the grave as their life. Ages pass. Ages vanish in the time that ages comes. To be discontent is to be human. For blind forces are tamed by the vision the soul possesses. Wonderful, isn't it? Wonderful. This one is quite well known from a poem that, in fact, will be recited. To navigate is necessary. I do not expect to enjoy my life, nor do I even think of enjoying it. I only wish to make it great, even if for that, my body and my soul must become the fuel for that fire. I only wish to make it belong to all of humanity, even if for that, I must lose it as my own. More and more, I think this way, more and more, I pour the very essence of my spirit into it. The impersonal purpose of elevating the nation and contributing to the evolution of humanity. This is the form that the mysticism of our people has taken within me. So, at that moment, you can clearly perceive this intention of idealism, this commitment to humanity, of elevating humanity's possibilities for understanding the world to a new level, of, through this marvelous channel that is beauty, breaking through resistance and raising human consciousness to a higher plane. There was this intention and, in many respects, it is highly successful. You may proceed. Here we have another text, and I ask for your forgiveness once again. But it is unmissable. This one comes from his diary. Now, I must apologize to the poet, because it is quite something to delve into someone's diary, isn't it? But today, this is public. And here, it reveals a bit of that pain. In fact, I have highlighted these points in red for you. These are fundamental points that he feels. It is a letter from him to himself. Although he says, on some occasions, that when he writes to himself, he is being literary. It is interesting how, at times, in the midst of his diary, you sense that he wears no masks. He is speaking to himself and reveals this anguish between what he wishes to be and what he manages to be in daily life, his inconsistency, his lack of will. My intense patriotic suffering, my deep desire to improve the state of Portugal, provoke within me, how can I express with what ardor, with what intensity, with what sincerity 1,000 projects? Projects that, even if they could be accomplished by a single person, would require from him a trait that is purely lacking in me, willpower. In other words, a characteristic I do not possess, which is purely absent in me. But I suffer to the very edge of madness, I swear, as if I could do everything, yet, nevertheless, I am unable to accomplish it due to a lack of willpower. It is a terrible suffering that, I affirm, keeps me constantly on the verge of madness. Other plans, which consume me with the urgency of being put into practice soon, combine to produce an overwhelming impulse, which paralyzes the will in me. The suffering this produces, I do not know if it can be defined as something that lies just short of madness. It is an enormous quantity of dreams and an inability of I will bring to life. To all this, add yet other reasons for suffering, some physical, some mental, my susceptibility to all common things that can be painful, or even things that would not be painful for an ordinary person, and add to that further complications, difficulties with money. Combine all of this with my fundamentally unbalanced temperament, and perhaps one can begin to grasp the intensity of my suffering. And, in fact, when you notice, when we look at the few photos that exist, at the end of his life, we see a man of 47 years old. He bears the worn expression of someone much older. It is the result, as if they were the scars of a war, an internal war. A war that never had a decisive victory for any of the sides that lived within him. So he lives and dies at war.
There comes a point when some of his friends, including his, in quotes, little girlfriend, who is Ophelia, no longer respond to his letters. Because some of them are, frankly, nonsensical. He reaches such a level of internal crisis, of contradiction, that he simply cannot bear it anymore. One can imagine, because this is the most controversial issue I have ever read about. Every scholar who comes to study the works of Fernando Pessoa arrives with a different number of heteronyms. I recently saw an author who spoke of 126 heteronyms. I have no idea where he got so many from. But there is a certain consensus that I have seen, at least, I don't know, because I don't know how many people discuss this, but about 2 or 3 voices settle around this number, which is 72. 72 heteronyms. From time to time, he would write something to a friend, sending them the work of someone, and the person would ask him, "Is this really someone else, or is it one of your heteronyms?" Because it was impossible to tell. It was impossible to tell. The number of heteronyms, and it's interesting because he would give the heteronym a date of birth, and sometimes even a date of death. He would create a horoscope. In the case of Alberto Cairo, he even made Alberto Cairo's astrological chart. The heteronym had a more well-defined personality than his own. At a certain point, he kills off Alberto Cairo. He kills Álvaro de Campos as well. The only one he doesn't kill is Ricardo Reis. Ricardo Reis leaves Portugal at the time of the proclamation of the Republic, comes to Brazil, and disappears. Later, Saramago writes a book imagining his death. So, these 3 heteronyms I mentioned to you are the main ones. Except for the one from the Book of Disquiet, which is another heteronym he uses. These are the most frequent, the most well-known, especially Alberto Cairo, whom he considers the greatest of them all. You can go ahead. This is Ophelia Queiroz, whom he met with 19 years old. There are many passages on this relationship, which is one of the most curious things in the world, as he treated it almost like a laboratory experiment with her. And she, who was no fool, began to notice this. This is also a passage written by him. Today, I no longer have a personality. Whatever is human in me, I have divided among the authors, several of whose works I have been the executor. Today, I am a meeting point, a gathering of a small humanity that is mine alone. In other words, countless beings. But no one really knows. He himself did not know. In truth, we can only suppose, based on certain consistencies throughout his life. But it seems that he became so lost that, at certain moments, he no longer knew himself. And Ophelia, who was not as naive as she seemed, created another heteronym for him, so to speak, which I believe is the most orthonymic of all, because it truly reflects who he was. She called him Ferdinand Personne, which in French means Fernando, nobody. Precisely because he had no personality, none at all. No one knew exactly who he was. He himself did not know exactly who he was. He became lost in the midst of all this. So, in fact, you can notice that there was a certain curiosity, an interesting one even, for understanding the different angles and points of view of the human psyche. This is analysis. Analysis requires that, at a certain point, you make a synthesis, and from there you develop a theory, a way of approaching life that may not be definitive, but can be refined over time. But analysis tends to lead you to a synthesis, so that from that point on, you respond to life in that way. This synthesis never happened for Fernando Pessoa. The synthesis, which was himself, remained unresolved. And the more he hesitated, thinking, I will do, the more the heteronyms multiplied, and the more fragile he became, and the less willpower he had to embrace a synthesis. He did not achieve it, and he became scattered, as he himself says. He says, I am a bit hysterical, a bit hysteroneurasthenic, which is the term he invented for his own psychological condition. In other words, a bit lost within myself. There is an interesting and powerful element in Fernando Pessoa, which is patriotism. But it is not a kind of patriotism rooted in boastfulness. It is a highly idealized form of patriotism. Beautiful, a beautiful message. His entire sense of patriotism is inspiring because, in truth,
For Portugal, it is almost a spiritual aspect, with a message and a mission to create a fifth spiritual empire, to be the head of the Sphinx of Europe. And he does not confine himself to political factors or to those matters that, at that time, were of interest to the country. His vision of Portugal is highly idealized, truly beautiful. Mensagem is a book like few others that are known, especially within the realm of poetry. It does not have highs and lows, contrary to what we find in Fernando Pessoa's work as a whole. Mensagem is consistently brilliant from the first to the last page. It is a remarkable book, and throughout it is a great ode to that epic spirit of Portugal, this human greatness that he represents through the spirits of Portugal. He even goes so far as to revive a legend that said Ulysses, the one from the Odyssey, was the founder of Portugal, that he passed through there during one of his adventures and became the founder of Portugal. So, in one passage of this book, in Mensagem, he includes a poem with that name Ulysses. And as I was telling you, the first stanza, the first 4 lines of Ulysses, are among the most beautiful passages, actually, the first 5 lines, within my own field, my own journey of knowledge and appreciation, especially regarding the idea of myth. It is brilliant, truly brilliant. I have shared this little stanza with you. The myth is the nothing that is everything. The same sun that opens the skies is a brilliant and worldly myth. The body of God, alive and naked. One could give an entire lecture just to talk about this. In fact, it is very characteristic of the esoteric perspective that the manifested universe is the death of unity. It is the body of God in decomposition. And those beings within the manifested universe who most preserve the attributes of unity are representatives. They are representatives of this unity in the manifested world. He takes the sun as the representative of divinity in the universe, where the body of God is dead, decomposed into countless parts, which is multiplicity. In short, it is a complex idea, highly esoteric, but it is the essence of the myth, an extraordinary beauty. His explanation of the myth, from a philosophical point of view, is perfect. Very, very beautiful. Well, everyone knows this little piece. There are certain things that are already part of the collective imagination, like that saying, everything is worthwhile. If the soul is not small, isn't that right? Which has almost become a popular saying. So many things that, by conveying such beauty, have truly become popular expressions. And this comes close to that. Oh, salty sea, how much of your salt are tears of Portugal, your Portuguese sea. How poetic, how beautiful this idea is, that the sea would be salted by the tears of Portugal. The greatness of Portugal as he imagined it. This other one here below, which is about the castles, is the one that portrays Europe as the Sphinx. In everything is perceived the level of esoteric knowledge that Fernando Pessoa possesses. Because the Sphinx is a symbol of the human self, which masters the animal self. It was a beastly thing, a destructive beast, and when a human head is placed upon it, it sits upon its own animal body, its lion's body, and gazes at the rising sun. So, it is a symbol of the human self imposing itself over the animal self. He outlines Europe as if it were the Sphinx, the paws, one country, the body, another country, and the head, which represents the human self, is who? Portugal, which gazes toward the west, toward the future. It is fascinating, this vision he has of Portugal, idealized as the one that will give birth to the Fifth Empire, one of the most spiritualized. With a sphinx-like and fateful gaze, the West, the future of the past. The face with which it gazes is Portugal. Portugal was loved and exalted in a way, as Camboyans would say, never before experienced. There, it is the final passage of the message, the last poem of the message, where he concludes. I won't read it all, but he ends with this invocation. It is the hour, it is the moment for Portugal to rise again, for this spirit to be reborn. For those who haven't read Mensajum, it is a book to keep on your nightstand. It is a book you should take with you to a deserted island. Wonderful. Some of the poems that will be mentioned here are from it, Dom Fernando, which is among the most beautiful things ever written in poetic form. Beautiful, marvelous, deeply mystical. It is truly a perfect book. You may go on. This photo is amusing because it said he sent a copy of this photo to Ophelia. She is said to have liked the photo, and he sent it to her with the following inscription: Fernando Pessoa, caught in the act. It was a crime, it was a crime. And it is said that he was drinking his cachaca, because he always drank cachaca. Agua Imperial was his favorite cachaca. There is a great deal of controversy regarding his death. What was recorded in the medical report was hepatic cirrhosis, due to constant intoxication throughout his life. Today, there are many discussions about this. Some question whether it might have been pancreatitis or something of that nature. The fact is, there is strong evidence that it was due to hepatic cirrhosis, because he was, in fact, increasingly alcoholic. He habitually gave himself over to drinking. So, this would have been a photo that he sent to her. Already at the end of his life, in the final stage of a reconciliation, because it seems that he went back and forth in this relationship about 3 times. And this death, as I mentioned in a text, about which he spoke so much the closer he got to it, the more it seemed, in a certain way, that he desired it as an end to all his suffering. You may proceed. It is said that he wrote this phrase on the eve of his death in the hospital. He wrote it in English, exactly like this: I know not what tomorrow will bring. On the eve of his death, I know not what tomorrow will bring. Is it true? There is this curiosity about the lives of geniuses. Rarely are they or their contemporaries aware of the genius. It is rare for someone to be a contemporary of a genius and know that they are in the presence of one. It is rare for the genius themselves to be aware of their own brilliance. There are exceptions. In the case of someone like Wolfgang, for example, it seems he knew what he was. But look, it is very rare. In general, you have a clear awareness of the impact you have made. It is evident that perhaps Fernando Pessoa had managed to reconcile all of this into a single unity, to synthesize his life. His impact might have been even more incisive. But the fact is that he made his mark. He left his message. He left his legacy powerfully. This is an element that it is indisputable. Whether for those who view him from a literary or modernist perspective, from any angle of his heteronyms, or for those who seek the soul of his true self, the philosophical soul of Fernando Pessoa himself, which is what matters most to us. And it is a bit of this soul that I would like to share with you in these last 2 texts, which are truly, truly beautiful. I believe you may already know them, but in any case, as Reed Globo says, it's worth watching again. Are you familiar with this poem? You, of whom the sun is but a shadow, of whom the world is but a corpse, guide my steps and cast your shadow over me as I feel myself solitary and profound. Anonymous and absent presence, of whom the soul is the veil, grant to my unconscious steps the consciousness that is yours. So that, through the passing ages of time or soul or reason, my dreams may become spheres, and my thoughts, vision. Evidently, this is a prayer. And the next one truly is a prayer. It is a supplication. Lord, who are the sky and the earth, who are life and death. You are the sun, and you are the moon, and you are the wind. You are our bodies and our souls, and our love is you as well. Where nothing exists, you dwell, and where everything exists, your temple is your body. Grant me a soul to serve you and a soul to love you. Give me sight to always see you in the sky and on the earth. Ears to hear you in the wind and in the sea. And hands to work in your name. Make me pure like water and lofty like the sky. Let there be no mud on the roads of my thoughts, nor dead leaves in the ponds of my intentions. Help me to know how to love others as brothers and to serve you as a father. May my life be worthy of your presence. May my body be worthy of the earth, your resting place. May my soul be able to appear before you like a child returning home. Make me great like the sun, so that I may worship you within myself. And make me pure like the moon, so that I may pray to you within myself. And make me clear like the day, so that I may always see you within me. And pray to you and worship you. Lord, protect me and shelter me. Grant me that I may feel I am yours. Lord, deliver me from myself. You may proceed. Well, this is the chest I told you about. It seems that there are things here that remain unpublished to this day. There are thousands of documents, some confusing, drawings. An enormous amount of material that has gradually been organized, compiled, published. Much of it is already available today, but some things still not. It seems that some have not yet been published. He wrote relentlessly, feverishly, practically every day of his life, from adolescence onward. You may go on. And here is his tombstone. My homeland is the Portuguese language. And indeed, he honors the Portuguese language. With his dedication, with his love, he perhaps elevated, and most likely brought, the Portuguese language to its highest levels of expression and beauty. Well, this is what I wanted to share with you. The time allotted to us, right? I hope I was able to convey this to you. The idea, the message, humbly, because I am not Fernando Pessoa to deliver great messages, but I hope I have made clear to you the potential, the beauty, and what lies behind this name. There was a great deal of philosophy there. Beyond poetry, a truly perfect union of these two tendencies. So it is very difficult, as a philosopher, not to love Fernando Pessoa. He is a consensus. It is very difficult for us, as his heirs, in our Portuguese language. So beautiful, yet so often mistreated, daily mistreated, and at the same time, as philosophers, we will see opportunities to be invited to elevate our consciousness. Let us be grateful to Fernando Pessoa. Well, now, we will invite our young poetry presenters. I will return in case you would like to ask any questions. Just to keep the sequence, let us listen to the poems. Thank you.
O salty sea, how much thy sharp salt is tears from Portugal, that we might cross you. Many mothers wept. The prayers of many sons were vain. How many maidens were lonely slept, that thou mightest be ours, O sea. Was the pain worth it? All is worth the pain if the soul is not small. Who longs beyond? The Cape Bojader must go beyond pain. God gave to the sea both danger and the abyss. But it is there that heaven mirrored lies.
God gave me his sword, for I wage his holy, sacred war. he consecrated me as his own, in honor and in disgrace. In the hours when cold wind sweeps over the cold earth, he placed his hands upon my shoulders and gilded my brow with his gaze. And this fever from beyond that consumes me, and this longing for greatness, bear his name, within me shines. And I will. And the light of the raised sword gives my face a calmness, filled with God. I do not fear what is to come, for whatever may come, it will never be greater than my soul.
Do not slumber beneath the cypresses, for there is no sleep in the world.
The body is the shadow of the robes that conceal
Your profound being.
Night comes, which is death, and the shadow ends without being. You go into the night, just a silhouette, like you without wanting to,
But at the inn
of wonder. Your cloak is taken by the angels.
you continue without a cloak on your shoulders.
With the little that covers you.
Then archangels of the road unclothe you and leave you bare.
You have no garments, you have nothing. You have only your body, which is you.
In the end,
In the depths of the cave, the gods unclothe even more.
your body ceases, outers the soul. But you see that they are all the same.
The shadow of your garments remained among us on fate. You are not dead among cypresses. Neophyte, there is no death.
To the gods, I only ask that they grant me to ask nothing of them. Happiness is a game, and being happy oppresses, because it is a certain state, neither still nor restless, my being calm. I want to rise high and above where men find pleasure or pain.
Ancient navigators had a glorious phrase. To navigate is necessary, to live it is not. I want for myself the spirit of this phrase, to transform its form so it matches who I am. To live is not necessary. What is necessary is to create. I do not think about enjoying my life, nor do I think about pleasure. I only want to make it great. Even if, for that, my body and my soul must become the fuel for that fire. I only want to make it belong to all of humanity. Even if, for that, I must loose it as my own. More and more, this is how I think. More and more, I pour the very essence of my spirit into the impersonal purpose of elevating my homeland and working for the evolution of humanity. This is the form that has taken within me the mysticism of our people